Thanks for staying on to CLTV News. You are watching Twilight, your favorite, sunset talk show on CLTV News. On the start of the program, I told you we'll be looking at the impact of the crisis in Eastern Europe on the world, and precisely Africa and Cameroon, especially when it comes to wheat, flour distribution, because we have the impression that the world is not faring well with that crisis, not just Africa but Europe too, because Russia is considered a giant on that continent. And to dissect all that for us this evening, we have a great mind in the house, Simon, Pascal, Alain, Handy. Good evening.
Yeah, good evening. Thanks for having me.
You are an international analyst. I just want us to go with international analyst, because if we want to go down the portfolio, we're going to use the entire program to...
The laundry list of achievement.
Right.
It's not really significant at this point. I think we're going to have an informative, intellectually stimulating, and entertaining conversation about major challenges facing our continent, and how, on a global scale, the continent can have and raise a relevant voice.
Now, it's been 9 months already since that crisis took a different proportion, and the world has been feeling the impact from Europe, Africa, especially East Africa. Now, what reading do you have to it at this point in time?
I think that is one of the major crises of our time, in the sense that it is challenging the rules-based world order that we inherited from 1945. And in that sense, I firmly believe that it's among one of the 5 major key issues facing global affairs. You have the energy crunch, you have the international food crisis. We're just coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change. And all of those issues are coalescing and presenting with unique challenges on how we're going to be able to repair and salvage that rules-based system. And if it's salvageable, how Africa can stand and speak with from a position of authority to validate a position where we move from the menu to the table, and then we have a vision and a perspective on how we reformulate the international architecture that is emerging.
You who have been very consistent with international affairs, do you see this coming?
Yeah, you could see it coming. It's been long in the making, because tectonic shift take places very slowly, and that is why the disruptive manifestation of crisis is so brutal in the eyes of those who have not been observing it. But it was clear from the end of the Cold War in 1991 that the never-ending its war expansion of NATO was going to clash and collide with the Russian national security interests. Now, as you know, we Africans do not take sides, because I fundamentally believe that not only we don't have a vested interest in this, we don't have a dog in this fight, as we usually say in neighborhoods. But I think that in 1991 there was already an open letter to President Clinton written by some of the most prominent intellectual and senators and dignitary in America. I mean, the cream of the crop. And that really warned the administration at that time that the promises made to the Russian authorities were to be respected, and then there was no redeeming value or no trickle-down benefit for international affairs in expanding and bringing the transatlantic alliance to the near border of Russia. So that letter is significant because it informed us of what was the political mood at the time. But there is also a significant fact. The conference, the Munich conference that took place in 2007 in Bucharest, in 2008 in Bucharest, was preceded, was followed up by the NATO summit, which actually saw the expansion of NATO to 5 other countries. And I think the message that was coming from Putin at the time was that Ukraine and Georgia were no-go zone.
Exactly.
Now, I'm not making the case for one side or the other, but I think that a thorough examination of empirical evidences, historical evidence, on the factual basis, we can say that this is an unprovoked war that could have been largely avoided with respect to not only the UN Charter, but also resulting to the natural toolbox that we use in terms of addressing and preventing, averting massive conflict.
But now the Russians have never admitted that it's actually a war. They say it's just a military operation, but the damages are well known today. Why is it taking too long for this to be resolved?
Yeah, it's taking too long because mainly, in my view, and I think if we want to speak more clearly, it's a proxy war, and that the sponsors on both sides are unwilling to come to the table because, as you have noted, strangely, since the beginning of the war, there has not been a major attempt to broker peace. Yes. And rather the contrary, that every attempt to even initiate a dialogue has been vilified and sidelined and marginalized. And so I think that firmly the Russians believe that their security interests are being significantly threatened. On the other hand, the Western coalition under the hegemon of the U.S. believes that they are in the right to expand the alliance up to Ukraine. So you have the fact that it is impossible at the time to reconcile those extreme positions, those opposing views. But I think that we have insufficiently used the resources of preventive diplomacy, use the resources of international negotiations and peaceful settlements of conflict. I speak from experience because I led negotiations that actually yielded international landmark political agreement. Okay. So I think we need to take into account the underlying interests of both parties, looking at how on a long-term basis the Russians can feel reassured that they will not be threatened in the near abroad, but at the same time that the Western values of democratic expansion and promotion of freedom can also be upheld in those territories. So you see, we have come at a fork in the road. The system is crashing before our eyes with far-reaching consequences for us in Africa, as you have seen, but also other part of the world. You're seeing significant power outages in Europe now, significant shortages in terms of fuel, and also the value-based system that actually has supported the state across the planet with the family. It's being radically changed in the course of these conflicts. But the conflict affects us. And that's what is of interest to me, because as you notice, the conflict took place against the backdrop of the EU-African Summit in February 2022. And that summit was to celebrate the New Deal between Europe and Africa, and that things were not going to be business as usual. But what happened in the early hours of the conflict is that African or people from African descent were targeted systematically and racially discriminated. That in the midst of a raging war, people would think and value their hatred for the black man, the black individual, was rather strikingly strange. But at the same time, it informed us that taking part in this conflict is not always in our advantage. As you know, when you look at the two World War, Africa was heavily involved in terms of providing not only the manpower, but the war effort. I mean, treasure was invested, blood was invested, but that did not actually yield significant trickle-down benefit for us as African. And I think that, informed by history very wisely, the African political leadership across the board has decided to stand on the sideline, and I think it's a position that I can understand.
So you feel these other conflicts, other crises should be an eye-opener to the African community, especially when it comes to economic affairs, because we've seen sanctions, economic sanctions that have been levied on Russia, and there have been very little or almost insignificant exportation, especially of wheat flour. Does that send Africans to the drawing board that they have to, shaken their economic foundation, so to see how they can feed themselves by themselves and not always have to depend on foreign countries?
Yeah, I think it's cumbersome upon Africans to take up their future in their own hand. 30 million square kilometers, and I think it's unacceptable that we find ourselves in this time, rather difficult, being basically begging for food from two countries that are warring factions. I mean, that are warring countries. Yeah. It's absurd. It don't make sense. It doesn't. And I think that that is also an eye-opener. That how in this very moment of fragmentation, of disruptive, coalescing crisis that are bound to change the architecture and the future of the planet. How do we sit at the table and articulate a vision to have a global influence and to be, at long last, people who are not always at the receiving end of incomings, but who are also able and capable of proposing how this future of our planet should be shaped, taking into account their own interests first.
Okay. Now, do you see any hope for the future? I understand you talked of both parties not willing to come to the table. But if this crisis continues, is this going to shape the world order?
But it's already affecting in a very significant way how the emerging new world order is going to be articulated. As you know, war is the worst form of man in humanity to man. And its destiny, its final destiny, it's peace. So I think that the voices of peace have been silenced for the moment. I think that the U.S. should come up with a major peace initiative to which and bring people to the table, because if support from the U.S. were to cease at the moment, I think that will have a significant impact on the dynamics of the conflict in Ukraine. Right now, why peace matter? It matters, first of all, because an empirical analysis, strategic analysis of the forces involved lead me to the conclusion that even under the influence of hallucinatory optimism, the Russians will prevail. Right now, they already have swallowed the Donbass. The Donbass is the size of Portugal in terms of the territory and so forth. And it seems that the Ukrainian will never see the Donbass again. So it is time to stop the bloodshed, find a sound solutions that take into account the underlying interests of both parties and offer a durable solution that can allow the people of Ukraine and Russia to live in a peaceful way, and then to create systems in which the majority of the people can flourish.
Okay. Now, you made a succinct analysis of this crisis and how it affects the world. And one part that caught my attention was when you made mention of the threat of nuclear, nuclear aspect of it. How well has the international or those concerned received this analysis from you?
Yeah. No, I think that all the talks about the use of nuclear weapon have been irrational, irresponsible, reckless, because the very nature of nuclear weapons is not to be used, but to serve as a significant deterrent and to protect, vital national interests of country. But what has been done in the case of Ukraine is to exacerbate tensions about, the use of nuclear weapons. It's basically the sacralizing the very nature of those weapons were weapons of last resort. As you know, there is never a winner in a nuclear. But what is more worrisome is that a massive influx of weaponry have been injected into the war in Ukraine in the midst of 50 nuclear reactors, increasing and heightening the possibility of an accident.
Especially with
so
with
you have 15 nuclear not
plant.
only do you have 15 nuclear reactors. I mean, some of the most significant nuclear plant in Europe are there, but in addition to that, you have bacteriological labs with the most lethal pathogens and so forth. So playing war in a zone, in an area like that, which is mired with risk and danger, in my view, has been significantly reckless, because those who are the protagonists of those wars are not responsible for the whole planet, and blowing up the whole planet on the basis of their differences is not a position that is just. It's unjustifiable. It's immoral, and that is why I believe that the voices of peace have to coalesce also now, and then put on the table a viable proposal and bring to that negotiating table both parties. But otherwise, what this is going to lead not only on never-ending conflict in that region, but also the durable fragmentation of the planet as we see it, because I don't see the institutions, the regulatory framework that was put in place in 1945 surviving in the long run if there is not a solution that is found in this war.
Okay. Now, besides being an international analyst, you also came up with this concept of the handy concept for connecting people, the HCCP. What's the concept?
The concept was basically in this time which is fraught with perils and security danger, which is seeing the radical transformation of our planet, and to realize that if we are going to help catapult our countries, respective countries, ahead, then we needed to have laboratory influence, laboratory of ideas that can serve as a basis to nourish the formulation of public policy and help enhance overall our position, our global positioning on the planet. So it's the convening of great minds for a healthy exchange of intellectual capital with a view to bridge the gap between those who elaborate and articulate a sound vision on how world affairs should be, and also the policymakers and the political system. Traditionally, intellectuals have tended to be there's been a chasm and a gaping hole between the academy and politicians in Africa. And we believe that those of us who have been fortunate enough to practice international diplomacy in international organizations, but keeping a leg in the academy, we can serve as a bridge to have policies that are more bold, that are sound, and that are to the benefit of the majority of our people. So what we are doing is really bringing those minds together, diversifying our perspective in that sense. Of course, we can no longer have the same relationship with Europe that we used to have in the past. And for that to happen, we need to put on the table our own proposals.
Exactly.
But we need to also, when you look at Colombia, Francia Marquez is from African descent. 5 million people from African descent are living in Colombia, and we should develop a Latin America strategy with Colombia and Brazil at its center. We can look at Singapore, who's also a shining example. We can look at all the other major part, diversifying, multiplying opportunities for the future of our country. And I think that that's the role that the HCCP-Global is meaning, and that is what we're going to deliver. I believe with maximum effectiveness. We're doing it already now, but also reviewing our relationship with America, putting in place a 6-lane highways of knowledge sharing on a variety of domains, trying to balance the soft power with the need of our youth, looking at what we can do with Canada. Just making it simple that we are going to be seeking opportunities wherever they are, and putting that to the benefit of the empowerment of our people.
Yes, that is in a nutshell, making Africa comfortable for Africans.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, thank you very much, Simon Pascal Andy, for your time. We very much appreciate those insights you've given to
the pleasure was mine.
The crisis in
The pleasure was all mine, and I was happy to be here and have that impromptu chat with you about major challenges facing us and how we can come up with common sense solutions.
Thank you very much. Assets are always ready to receive minds like you, and I hope we have the green card to invite you whenever we...
Je serai très heureux de revenir parler avec vous à n'importe quel moment sur les principales questions qui fouettent l'intelligence africaine en ce moment et la manière que nous proposons en tant que laboratoire d'idées de nourrir les politiques publiques, la formulation des politiques publiques, mais aussi notre position dans le monde.
Thank you very much. Now let's take this brief break. When we come back, we shall be looking at the role of cooperatives, especially in boosting food security.